I'm conscious that some of the previous speakers might have covered some of the ground I'm about to cover, so I won't seek to repeat or go into too much detail on that. But there may be some other elements in what I'm about to say that are new to you. I should start by thanking iStruct for the opportunity to speak to you all today, and I hope you find what I'm about to say instructive and helpful. What I'm going to talk to you about is regulation and enforcement. I'm not going to talk to you about the swathes and details and intricacies of the regulatory landscape, because I suspect that you would quickly fall asleep. Rather, I'm going to try and give you some insights into various roles and how we, for our part in the BSR, would seek to approach how we look at those roles and how we think about enforcement, if any enforcement, in relation to the discharge of those functions. I'll start with the role that I suspect many of you might be interested in, which is the principal designer role. You'll see there on the slide some of the aspects that we anticipate the principal designer will have. I think it's important to say that we're not anticipating that the principal designer will be an expert in every design specialism. But they do need to know enough about the building regulations to assess whether a building design will comply with the functional requirements of the building regulations. And I'm saying that quite deliberately. This isn't about the approved documents. It's about the functional requirements of the building regulations. Now, it sounds a bit obvious to say, but within the health and safety landscape, and some of the previous speakers have talked about how CDM has been quite influential here. Sometimes the principal designer role is contracted out to a health and safety consultant who has limited authority or influence over the design. What we're wanting in the building environment arena is that it's very clear that the principal designer is the organization that leads the design team. The whole point of that role is to ensure there's no gaps, no siloed working, that the building is assessed holistically. It's the PD, principal designer, who has the key responsibility to do this. And I think these are statements of the obvious, I do acknowledge, but I think they bear repeating. The impact of the designers, people in that profession, whatever their specialism, can bake in good design or not so good design. We're seeing that to an extent with Planning Gateway 1, which one of the previous speakers said had been introduced last year, about 18 months ago. We have seen design submissions at the planning stage where HSE is a statutory consultee on the fire statement. Submissions that, on the basis of what we can see, would compromise firefighters and residents' safety. And I've given some examples there. I think the travel distance is one that's always struck home to me. There are certain requirements related to the size of a building's floor pan and the travel distances that are acceptable from a fire shaft. The number is 30 metres. And we've seen designs that suggest that actually 34 metres is acceptable. And it's only 4 metres there and 4 metres back, but it's worth remembering that these are incredibly hostile environments and that the firefighter may have already climbed some distance vertically to get to the floor on which they're seeking to fight the fire or rescue a casualty. So to all intents and purposes, that 4 metres there and 4 metres back is a very considerable distance for that firefighter to be expected to walk, in addition to the 30 metres that are deemed in the standard to be the outer extent of a reasonable distance for a firefighter to travel. And I would want to tell you that those examples are rare, but unfortunately we've seen in some months up to 60% of the submissions that we comment on are receiving a concern or even a serious concern being expressed by us back to the local planning authority. And this reflecting on earlier speakers in an age after Grenfell. I'll move on to the principal contractor. The principal contractor has the role to coordinate the construction works on a project. This is a concept that's deeply embedded Within CDM, the expectation is the principal contractor takes responsibility for site planning, managing, monitoring the work. All the expectations that you're familiar with for the principal contractor in CDM have more or less been lifted and shifted into the new regime that's proposed for buildings. Our experience is that monitoring from that plan, manage and monitor equation is frequently overlooked. And we also see in the health and safety field that problems occur when the paperwork looks okay, but the people aren't actually doing work in line with the paperwork. So a principal and contractor should have arrangements in place to monitor the building work and record this to make sure that it complies with the law being the functional requirements of the building regulations. And we'd suggest that the principal contractor can't do that if they're in their site hut all day. What's happening on paper needs to be checked that it's happening in reality. And there needs to be a flow of information, that the right information gets to the right people who can then do the right thing. They can't, the principal contractor, execute their functions in isolation from the designers. And I'm aware that there has been some concern expressed by the design community as to an imbalance of power between the design community and the contractors. The designer can suggest, recommend, exhort, but the contractor then just does what they feel they want. You may be aware from the consultation that's taken place on the regulations that are in development here that when the principal designer provides comments to the principal contractor in relation to compliance with the building regs, the principal contractor must have regard to those comments. They must have regard to those comments. That's a little legalistic in its phraseology, but it does say that the principal contractor can't ignore the principal designer. They have to have a reason for not doing what the principal designer is suggesting. And of course, that implies that there is an acknowledgement of a degree of risk on the part of the principal contractor that they are ignoring what the principal designer says. We've talked a little bit about competence already. It's a statement of the bleeding obvious to a certain extent that the PC and PD will need to be competent. And I've put up there a couple of standards, PAS standards, that set out a framework for competence. The competence of the principal designer, the competence of the principal contractor sets the standard and will push down and drive everyone else's competence on site. These standards talk about a range of knowledge that's required, technical knowledge of standards, the ability to manage and liaise with different stakeholders, technical and legal knowledge, those kinds of things are all contained within. Of course, much of the material that's out there at the moment focuses on individuals, but when one gets beyond the smallest sites, one is into the PD and PC being organizations. And in these circumstances, it's probably right to think about organizational capability. And that requires the organization to make sure it can get the right people to do the right things, to have the right competencies to execute the functions that's being expected of them. So that's around the management policies, the procedures, the systems, to ensure that what individuals are doing within that organization is within their competencies, and that organization has access to skills, knowledge, and experience it needs. It can either get them internally, or it can know when it's reached the limits of its capability and make sure it has access to those skills, knowledge, and experience from other sources. I did want to talk to you a little bit about enforcement. As regulators, as part of the Health and Safety Executive, we place a great deal of store by being a proportionate regulator. Our response to the things that we find is scaled on the basis of their severity. In these circumstances, and when thinking about the roles of the PD and the PC and the client, which I'll come on to in a moment, we are likely to follow what we call a track-back approach. This is something that we do in construction under occupational health and safety, and we feel it's got merit in the way that we'll approach these issues in the environment of buildings. So if we were to come across a breach of the building regulations, we would consider what's the degree of severity, what's the impact of that breach, and then work back up the supply or design change from the evidence of non-compliance with the building regulations. What were the acts and omissions that led to that non-compliance occurring? Do these constitute a breach of what the PC and PD and client should have done? Now, the key thing in making an enforcement decision isn't was there a breach or isn't there, because that would be a tick box exercise, but rather what standards were we expecting and what did we find? The bigger the gap, the more likely we are to take enforcement action. The bigger the gap, the more significant the enforcement might be. When I talk about expected standards, the word I typically use is benchmarks. And those benchmarks might be standards such as British standards. It might be that we're using or praying in aid the approved documents. It might be that we're using authoritative guidance, and that might be from a variety of sources. It might have come from the regulator, it might have come from government, or it might have come from industry. And thinking back to what Dame Judith was talking to us about earlier, we are very much in the space of wanting industry in all its guises to demonstrate leadership. And one of the ways that industry can demonstrate leadership is to develop, promulgate its own standards, that its own authoritative guidance demonstrates that industry is taking control and taking ownership of the risk and is seeking to set benchmarks against which it will judge itself. And we as regulators will also use those standards to judge how industry is performing. Now, we do have a number of enforcement tools available. I won't go into a huge amount of detail, but they include stop notices and things such as that to stop work, notices that would require the correction of work. And there are the legal duties that other people have talked about and the options for prosecution. But I don't want to sit here and sort of do the scare you type line, because I see enforcement as being the thing that we will do when things have gone wrong. I am keen, as other speakers are, to encourage you to do the right thing, to make sure that you have the skills, knowledge and experience, to make sure you understand the building regulations, etc., and to do what is required to comply with the functional requirements of those regulations first time. Because thinking back to a previous speaker, it's fair to say that to not do the right thing first time costs considerable amounts of money, as we're seeing played out in real time now. Clients have a role as well. They're not immune. They must play an active role. It's a key requirement that they put sufficient time and resource in place, and that at the end of the day might come down to money. Flipping that the other way around, if the arrangements don't work because of financial or time pressures that the client has put on the other players, then the client may find themselves that they have legal liability. If, for example, the PDPC fail to implement monitoring processes, but the problems can be tracked back to a client's unwillingness to put in the necessary funds or a result of undue pressure from the client, then we might turn our attention to the client rather than the PD or PC, even though apparently the weakness is in their arrangements rather than what the client has done. I have to say, it's not binary. The client's role may not be immediately obvious to regulators, and it might require the investigation, the track back that I talked about earlier. But the law is clear. The client should be held accountable if pressure is making it such that compliance with the building regulations can't be achieved. I do want to talk a little bit about BSR as a building control body, and I don't intend to rerun the overview that was given by one of the earlier speakers. But we are the statutory consultee at Planning Gateway 1. At Planning Gateway 2, and this is about HRBs, high-rise buildings. This is not about other types of buildings. Gateway 2 is what we call a hard stop. So we may not permit the commencement of construction at Gateway 2 if we're not satisfied that the plans will achieve compliance with the functional requirements of the building regulations. If we're concerned, we may require greater regulatory intervention, inspections, if we're worried about a particular site, or if we have low confidence in the organisations that are actually sponsoring that activity. This is an approach that we've deployed in our health and safety field. It's our confidence in the duty holder. That's how we describe it. And if you're an organisation that doesn't have a good track record, who have had weak processes in the past, who may have faced enforcement, you may find yourself receiving more attention than if you're an organisation who have good structures, a good track record, and are an organisation that have given us confidence that you're able to run the construction process, the running of a building, whatever it happens to be, in a good way. And we may not, at Gateway 3, if the as-built building doesn't comply with the building regulations, we may not permit occupation of it. And later, of course, when the accountable person, the duty holder who runs the building when it's occupied, their safety case may end up with weaknesses because of the building work that's been done before, perhaps not done well, and that will affect their ability to get a building assessment certificate. So all players in the process may find themselves under a scrutiny from the BSR. This is in relation to HRBs, I have to emphasize, because much of what I've talked to you about, PCPD client, applies to all buildings, not just HRBs. And that's another key message I would want you to take away. The responsibility of the principal designer, the principal contractor, the client, the designer, and the contractor apply to all buildings, not just high-rise buildings. Outside of the HRB sphere, enforcement will be by local authorities as building control bodies. And what are currently called approved inspectors, what will become registered building control approvers, if they are coming across issues where they think that the defects in any building, the non-compliance with the building regulations can't be easily dealt with, they may have to revert that project back to the local authority for the local authority to consider enforcement action. There's, when you receive the slides from this, you'll see that there's some resources I've put there. I would urge you, if you haven't already, to sign up to the HC's web pages and the e-bulletin that we produce on a regular basis. That's going to be the first source of news. There are also 2 citizen spaces. That's where government consultations are posted now. DLUC, the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, are running the consultations on the regulations and the consultations on the policy, the regulatory approach. So all of their consultations will be on their citizen space, and there are some on there now. Where we are producing material that we need to consult on, could be, for example, draft guidance or materials such as that, we will post it on our HC citizen space. That's where we put the recent consultations on the operational standards rules and the building inspector competence framework. Both of those are about the regulated profession that we're introducing for building control. I've not troubled you with that today, but you can find that material there and other material that will emerge in due course. And I think that's me concluded. So I will seek to navigate back to my Zoom and seek to stop sharing. Thank you.
That was fabulous. Thank you so much, Tim. We've had a number of questions come in. As I said, we're going to do a short Q&A specific to your presentation just now. So we've had a couple of questions actually which touch on things that were raised earlier. And I think one of the interesting ones to start off with is in relation to the client's role in this, and whether there is going to be any simple guidance, as there is with the current CDM regulations, that can be sent to clients as building owners, sort of outlining what their responsibilities under the Act are.
There will be guidance that will accompany the various regulations as they come out. That will be the official guidance. I don't believe we've got any plans to produce material. I would put it back in the direction of industry. That leadership might be that the industry actually helps the clients who are paying it to understand their responsibilities and make sure that the clients discharge it. it is very much in the industry's interests to do that.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And another question that was actually asked again during the previous presentations, and I think you've touched on it quite nicely, is actually about the capacity of building control, and whether they, how they're going to sort of meet the demands of the building safety and all the things that they're going to, the extra responsibilities that they potentially have under this.
I think there's a number of things to say there. First of all, in the HRB regime, the building safety regulator will be drawing in building control expertise as part of multidisciplinary teams that will support us to make our regulatory decisions on the gateways, etc. In the non-HRB sphere, I think it's recognised that the building control profession, in terms of its capacity, has been under pressure for a little while. And I would congratulate my colleagues at LABC for their work, supported by government funds, to bring in new trainee building control surveyors, building inspectors. I think they've managed to bring in some 160 people, or at least that's their target, and they're well on the way to achieving that. And they are making sure that those individuals are distributed to councils to backfill the demand that the BSR will place on those councils to serve the needs of the HRB regime. But also, of course, those 100 and odd individuals are starting on an excellent career as a building inspector, and they are the future of building control as the current experienced people naturally reach the end of their career. So I think the future for building control capacity is brighter than it was some time ago. As things pan out, as the regime settles in, it will become apparent whether that capacity is sufficient. But I don't think anybody would suggest that that will become a stagnant situation, because I do see building control as a profession potentially undergoing something of a revival in terms of the steps that we're taking, but also, as I say, colleagues at LABC.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tim.